Okay, if you're a fan of Ozzy Osbourne, especially the early days when he first started out on his solo career and this album came out, Blizzard of Ozz, I think you'll really enjoy the video I have for you today. What this is I found an article that's basically a concert review while he was on this tour, but it asks an interesting question or has this interesting idea right at the beginning that I want to share with you and get your feedback about. You know, it's always interesting thinking about how did we first get introduced to some of these people, some of these rock stars, like Ozzy, for example. You know, when it was probably it had to be 1981 when this happened, but I was going to what was then junior high school. I was in 7th or 8th grade, and I would go into my math class, and this particular class, I don't know what it was, but every single time we would have this class, this kid, that was older than me, so, I mean, I was 12, he was probably 14 years old, but had this long hair, jean jacket, would come walking into my math class. He wasn't actually even in the class. He just was, he knew the teacher or something, and he'd come into the classroom, and on the board, he would very artistically write out Ozzy. And he'd come in, Ozzy, he was just one of those kids. And he'd have Ozzy, emblazoned on the back of his jean jacket. And I'm sitting there as this kid in this junior high school going, what's an Ozzy? And of course, it didn't take long before all the kids that were into hard rock and heavy metal were talking about Ozzy Osbourne and this album that had come out. And it must have been, when this was happening, must have been right around the time this article was written, because it was just probably not long before Diary of a Madman would come out. But it's amazing looking back. We have a few videos on this channel about this album and different things. And it just always fascinates me that this album has had the staying power that it has, especially the song Crazy Train. Just go to some sporting event. I'd imagine if you've been to a sporting event sometime in the last year or so, you've probably heard this song at a sporting event. The introduction to the song Crazy Train is so iconic, that gonna, dun dun. It was just, and then the Randy Rhoads guitar riff that comes in, it's so amazing. And again, it's just one of those things that just has that perfect energy for moments like a sporting event. And that's why I just know I've been to sporting events before, and it comes over the loudspeakers. All of a sudden, it's like, there's Ozzy again, 40 years later. All right, I'm going to read this article to you. And this is from the Arizona Republic, Tuesday, June 30th, 1981. And so again, this is on the tour for the album Blizzard of Ozz, and just a few months before Diary of a Madman comes out. And the title of this article is Solid Heavy Metal Performance Puts Fans in a Boisterous Mood. And now this first couple of paragraphs, this is the thing I wanted, that jumped out at me when I read this, that I wanted to talk to you about today and get your feedback on. So listen to how this starts. Ozzy Osbourne is not what God intended lead singers to be. For a start, he has a round, merry face similar to that of the English comedian Benny Hill. And then there's the sturdy, earnest figure he cuts on stage. It's not dramatic or sensual, or lean and hungry, or graceful, or any of the other star qualities lead singers are supposed to have. And so you think of kind of what you imagine a rock star is supposed to look like. And again, put this in the context, especially of this is written in June of 1981. The 70s started out, we lost Jim Morrison at the beginning of the 70s, but he's the front man for the Doors. He's this sex symbol, this really good looking guy. You had Paul McCartney, who was now not in the Beatles, but had his solo career in Wings, and he's just this really good looking dude. Roger Daltrey is with The Who. They're popular through the 70s, another really nice looking guy. Mark Farner. Grand Funk is huge throughout the 70s. He's got that long hair, and he's kind of muscular. This another really, really nice looking guy. I mean, you got Ted Nugent, Barry Gibb. I mean, even Brad Delp from Boston was a relatively good looking guy. Robert Plant, for heaven's sake. Talk about a sex symbol. He is the ultimate rock star all through the 70s. Paul Stanley, the sexy guy in Kiss. David Lee Roth, obviously. You have all these guys that really look like what you would think this is what a rock star looks like. And then there's Ozzy. He is not the stereotypical idea of what you think a rock star should be. And what's so interesting to me is every once in a while you have these people, like Meatloaf, for example, not at all what you expect to be that guy, and yet he becomes this utter legend of a singer. Just had this massive impact on the industry, one of the biggest selling albums of all time. And again, he doesn't even come close to the stereotypical idea of what a rock star should be. And then you look at a guy like Ozzy, and here he was in 1981, and similarly, what was it? What was it about him that not only made him famous then, so that, you got this kid walking around and writing his name, being the evangelist for Ozzy in my little junior high school, probably happening all over the country. But what was it about him that he, to this day, here we are in 2025, I think everybody knows his name. I look at all the people that were famous when I was a kid. How many of them do I think my parents would be able to say who they are? Not a lot of them, some of them, but they certainly know the name Ozzy Osbourne. Everybody does. And so you have to ask yourself, when you have this guy that does not fit any of those stereotypical ideas, what was it about him? What was the charisma that Ozzy Osbourne brought to the table that made him this iconic figure that he became and remains to this day? And it's interesting because I think of these things every once in a while. And then when I stumbled across this article, the first thing this guy says is he goes, he's not what God intended lead singers to be, because we kind of look at him and go, yeah. And you look at the pictures that we'd see of him throughout the 80s, and a lot of times he was a little bit overweight, and then he cut all his hair off, and there was just nothing really about him that just said rock star, especially when you go down like that list that I threw out just a minute ago. Anyway, I'm going to keep going on this because this is actually kind of an interesting article historically, talking about some of the people that were involved. And it says, so it finishes that, qualities lead singers are supposed to have, but it is well loved. At 31 years old, 3 years after splitting from Black Sabbath, Ozzy Osbourne can still count on loyal fans. More than 8,000 of them came to the Activity Center, probably more than would have turned out if the show had gone ahead as first scheduled at Veterans Memorial Coliseum last Thursday. So I guess in this situation, there'd been some sort of a cancellation or a reschedule. Osbourne and his band, Randy Rhoads guitar from Los Angeles, ex-Rainbow bass guitarist Bob Daisley, and this is actually a really interesting thing too from a historical standpoint. Bob Daisley, who had played bass guitar with Rainbow since the album Long Live Rock and Roll. Now, who sang on Long Live Rock and Roll? You guessed it, Ronnie James Dio. So fascinating. Dio, who is with Ritchie Blackmore when he forms Rainbow, eventually leaves Rainbow to join Black Sabbath. Ozzy gets kicked out of Black Sabbath, and the guy who'd played bass with Dio, who's now with Black Sabbath, goes off and plays with Ozzy. Anyway, just interesting things to see all these little interconnected people. So Bob Daisley had played with Rainbow. And one time Uriah Heep drummer Lee Kerslake. Now, Uriah Heep, a lot of people know a lot about them these days, but if you remember the song that Uriah Heep had was kind of a hit called Easy Livin'. Lee Kerslake had played on that song. Okay, give their audience an energetic and highly appreciated set that lasted about 75 minutes. They're just saying that that's what the concert was, that came from Ozzy. As one might expect from a founding member of Black Sabbath, one of the premier heavy metal bands of the 70s, the music was basic and extremely loud. The even sound balance of the new band's debut album, Blizzard of Ozz, was not reproduced accurately live. In its place was the inflammable energy of a live performance. And by the way, if you've ever seen Ozzy ever in concert, you talk about a guy that just brings it, that brings the performance to the people. He's that guy. And by the way, it's also interesting to note, when it says band's debut album, there were so many weird little misunderstandings about this when it first came out, because this album was not intended to be called Ozzy Osbourne Blizzard of Ozz. Blizzard of Ozz was supposed to be the name of the band. And these other two guys, who were actually like veteran rock stars, didn't really like it when the album showed up and this was the cover, where they put Ozzy in this big, main billing, and then Blizzard of Ozz kind of in subtext. That was supposed to be the name of the band, and Ozzy was just kind of a name to just an attraction part of it, right? Where people would go, oh yeah, this is Ozzy's band, but the band was supposed to be called Blizzard of Ozz, and that ended up causing some ill feelings in the group because of that, the billing that Ozzy took in this. The material came from the album and also from Osbourne's contribution to Black Sabbath's repertoire. Rhodes, Daisley, and Kerslake did what was expected of them smoothly and professionally. The show was not visually spectacular in terms of lights or effects. The focus naturally was on Osbourne, who made use of it to arouse the audience. Between stomping and pacing and having tete-a-tetes or tete-a-tetes, or I actually, before reading this, I'd never seen that term before. I had to look it up, and it's spelled TETE-A-TETES. With his lead guitarist, he issued directives to the crowd. I think I looked it up, and what it means is that you have kind of a little private conversation. It's what it's apparently that's what that means. Issued directives to the crowd. These began with things like getting people to stand up, put their hands up, and shout, and ended with Osbourne encouraging a general rush to the area just in front of the stage. Neither Osbourne nor his accompanists have a particularly distinctive sound, but the songs they have composed are a cut above the usual heavy metal subject matter. And by the way, again, part of the question I wanted to ask here, and he addresses it a little bit, but what is it that made Ozzy such a big deal? Well, if you ever saw him in concert, there was something about him, the massive amount of energy that he just brought to the audience, and he's constantly trying to get people to clap and stand up and shout and yell and on and on. But if you never saw him live, again, then what was the attraction? Because I was a big fan long before I ever saw him live. So lyrics on the Blizzard of Ozz album are refreshingly offbeat. Quote, if you're going to sell an album, write something with a bit of a message on it, says Osbourne in a brief interview after the show. There's too many people polluting rock just for the financial gain. I'm in it for the fun of it, unquote. That's Ozzy saying that. Instead of the usual rock diet of girl songs, Osbourne and the band effectively tackle war. In Revelation, a song he said was inspired by the crisis over Afghanistan, the folly of suicide as a solution, and a song about British occultist, the late Aleister Crowley. Black Sabbath has a long history of occult songs, but Osbourne said he has never been involved in the occult, and that the song could just as well have been called Mr. Smith as Mr. Crowley. Except then I think most of the words probably wouldn't fit so well, but anyway, just reading what he says here. Like many others who have suddenly branched out after years with the same outfit, Osbourne talked like a revitalized man. And this is what I was talking a little bit about earlier. There's so many people, so many bands where a member will leave and go strike out on their own to do their own thing. The band may carry on, and so often it just doesn't work. But in this case, one of those rare situations where the singer gets kicked out of the band, goes and does a solo thing, and arguably does way better than the band he left. Has a longer, stronger career as a result of it. As a matter of fact, you could argue that the reason Black Sabbath continued to succeed was because Ozzy kept succeeding. So anyway, this is just a really unusual scenario. And it gets me back to that question. Why? Why? What was it about him that this worked? Let's see here. Osbourne spoke about the challenge of starting fresh after years with Black Sabbath when sold-out tours were a virtual certainty. Asked why he had left Black Sabbath, he first said, musical directions. I didn't like their music and they didn't like mine. I feel I outgrew them. I was fed up with singing about wishing wells and fairy tales. The best way was to get out of it and start again, unquote. Later, he admitted to serious personality clashes in the group. Quote, for the last 5 years, working with those people, I was working with it was so depressing. No one was talking to each other, unquote. After quitting Black Sabbath, they have a misprint here. Osbourne said he thought about retiring. It lasted a week, and in that week, I wrote 4 songs. Now, if you go back and listen to the stories of Geezer Butler and Tony Iommi, they have a kind of a different view of why and how Ozzy left the group. But it's fascinating here that in both cases, as the band split, as Ozzy went off and as Tony and Geezer and Bill were on their own at that point, in both cases there was this question, do we just quit? Because Black Sabbath, Tony felt the same way. Like, maybe this is over and we just need to start over with something else. And ultimately, Black Sabbath, as we said earlier, picked up Ronnie James Dio. They carried on. I loved the Ronnie James Dio stuff, and then he left, and then, that's a whole nother story. And then Ozzy went on, as he said here, wrote some songs, and then he ended up having this massive career. The band now has the material for a second album to be called Diary of a Madman. Osbourne said, and to be released in the fall. So Diary of a Madman then would be released in October of 1981. So July, August, September, October. So about 4 months later, after this article was written, Diary of a Madman would come out. With his financial future secure, Osbourne said he stays in rock music to keep young and in the hope he can communicate something worthwhile to his fans, who included a 14-year-old boy that used to come into my math class and write his name on the chalkboard. I'm curious, did any of you have something like that where you had these kids with the jean jacket, the long hair, and they were just these Ozzy Osbourne crazy fanatics? If you had somebody like that in your school, because we had more than just him. We had a lot of people in that school that just was all about Ozzy, and that was them, the long hair, the jean jacket, the whole thing. Okay. He was particularly concerned after Sunday's show about what he considered to be very heavy-handed treatment of concert goers by security men. He claimed security men had beaten up fans near the front of the stage and was concerned this might reflect badly on his show. Parents, he said, might keep their kids from his shows because of such incidents. And there were legends following Ozzy from town to town. He didn't even need this in particular to happen. There was so many rumors going on around him all the time that gave parents plenty of reason for them not to want their kids to go see him. Anyway, if you know about Ozzy, you know about all that stuff. Earlier, near the end of a heavy metal set even more basic than Osbourne's, Motorhead had dedicated a song called Overkill to, quote, the security men of America. Okay, so to put this in context, I think I may have read this earlier, but Motorhead was opening up for Ozzy on this concert. And this song Overkill, if you've never heard the song Overkill by Motorhead, I don't know when double bass, double kick became a really, really big thing in heavy metal and hard rock. But Phil Taylor, the drummer from Motorhead, I think they call him Phil Filthy Animal Taylor, he's a great drummer. And if you listen to that tune or go watch a video of it, this is, again, remember, this is happening in 1981. And Phil is doing this double kick pattern. I don't think he stops through the entire song. I mean, it's like this, it's not super, super fast, but it's fast enough. And that I'm always amazed by a drummer that can just do that for 3-4 minutes straight. Just keep going and going and going. And also, it's just interesting from a historical standpoint that this was happening, Motorhead doing that song Overkill in the early days of the double kick thing, when people really started this idea of bringing that a double kick drum into a song. These days, it's everywhere. I mean, by the time heavy metal really got going, I mean, so many people were doing it. But this was in those early days. So if you haven't listened to it, that's a really cool tune to go listen to by Motorhead, where you can get that sense of those early days of double kick, double bass drums. Okay. Osbourne believed his fans should be able to express themselves physically during a show. That was part of the rock and roll heritage. And then this is interesting listening to him say this next. Rock and roll is my life and my religion, said Osbourne, which is kind of interesting because on his next album, Diary of a Madman, he would have a song called You Can't Kill Rock and Roll. And it says, 'cause rock and roll is my religion and my love. So, knowing that he was putting this album out, he'd probably already written and recorded that song at this point, and it's on his mind. And he says in this article, unbeknownst to everybody else who had no idea, what was going to be coming in a few months, he makes his comment, rock and roll is my life and my religion, said Osbourne. Once you get into this game, it gets into your blood, keeps you young. Most of the guys I grew up with have ulcers and miserable wives. My wife said to me, what are you going to do when you're 55? As long as these kids want to hear me, I'll be there forever. They'll crucify me in the end, which is also kind of a funny statement because as you recall, back in the early 90s, Ozzy retired. He had his No More Tours tour. And I actually went and saw him at Red Rocks on that tour, which was going to be his last tour. And as you know, it wasn't even close to not only Ozzy's last tour, but it wasn't even close to his last tour as Ozzy as a singer of Black Sabbath, because years later he'd go back with Black Sabbath, and I saw him on that final tour as well, where with Black Sabbath. And so he just kind of, every time he threatens to quit, he just keeps going. So when he talks about he talked about being 55, that he just keep doing it the rest of his life, and then he decided to retire, and then not really. Anyway, just kind of funny thing watching him over the years. Responding to Osbourne's complaint about the security men, Miriam Bogle, managing director of the Activity Center, said she knew of no out-of-the-ordinary clashes between security men and fans Sunday. Quote, the way I interpret it, there was simply a difference in philosophy, she said. I think the band is a little more easygoing about the way their fans behave. We are a little more strict. Safety is emphasized, and we expect people to behave like ladies and gentlemen and stay in their seats. If they want to play our building, the philosophy comes with the building. It's as simple as that. And I just think that's just funny because, because Ozzy's whole thing, he wasn't necessarily telling people to go, start a riot, but he always, if you ever saw him in concert, it was always this, go crazy, yelling, shouting to go crazy 500 times every show, telling people to stand up, telling people to clap and move. And, that was his thing. And so it's no surprise that when some of these concerts would happen, there'd be a little bit of mayhem in the process, because you combine that with the music, the attitude, the overall thing, the young teenagers that were there, experiencing something that you would have that kind of a thing at a concert like that. I never saw him in these early days. I was 12 when this album came out, or 11 when this album came out. So, but I ended up over the years really being a big fan of Ozzy in general. I didn't love all of his quote unquote solo albums, but there was a lot of stuff over the years I thought was really spectacular. Of course, he had some amazing guitar players over the years that worked with him, starting with Randy Rhoads. Brad Gillis was an excellent guitar player. Jakey Lee, of course. Eventually we get to Zakk Wylde, who is just really just a spectacular, that's just such an understatement. He's such a great, and he's really cool. But even with that, because he didn't always have the same guitarist, things were changing around him all the time. I want to get back to this question. What was it? What was it about him? What was it about this guy that, as he says at the beginning of this article, for a start, he has the round, merry face similar to that of the English comedian Benny Hill. What was it about a guy that did resemble Benny Hill a little bit that turned him into arguably one of the biggest rock stars of all time? That made him got him to the point that he became a household name, even having songs that would long outlast his career. I'd imagine that the beginning of that song "Crazy Train" will be played 40 years from now, still in sporting events and around, just because of what happened there. And so many of his songs were just spectacular that way. And then you go back into the early Black Sabbath days, and he was this just interesting guy. I've wondered about this over the years, because I think about things like this. What was it that made him this legend in that way, that put him on the map? And so I'd really love to get your feedback on this. And we sometimes put out videos where we read people's comments. This is definitely one. If we get a lot of interesting comments, I'm sure we'll make a video where we go through and read them and talk about them, because it is such an interesting idea. When you look at these people, somebody like Meatloaf, what was it about these people that just don't fit into that mold that we normally think of as a rock star, and then that they end up being these legendary figures that seem a little bit out of place, that don't fit that stereotypical ideal that we kind of expect. Okay, anyway, hey, please follow the channel if you're not following the channel already. Share this with your friends. You probably know other people that are interested in this stuff like this. Share it on YouTube, throw it on Facebook, whatever, but we'd really love it if you'd share it with people. Like the video, and again, I'd love to get your feedback on this idea. And anyway, hey, with that, have yourself a fantastic day.